By 1811, almost the entire European continent lay under French influence or direct control. The wars that had begun in the 1790s as the defense of the revolution had turned into an empire ruled from Paris. Napoleon Bonaparte, once a Corsican artillery officer, had made himself emperor of the French and master of Western Europe. The only major continental power outside his system was Russia. Tsar Alexander I had been his uneasy ally since the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, but the alliance never rested on trust. The continental system, Napoleon's embargo against British trade, strangled the Russian economy. Alexander resented the presence of French troops in Poland and distrusted Napoleon's creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw on Russia's western frontier. By the end of 1811, both men had already decided that another war was inevitable. Napoleon's army was the largest ever assembled in Europe up to that time. He called it the Grand Armée, the Great Army. It contained soldiers from every corner of his empire: French, Italians, Poles, Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine, Dutch, Swiss, Croats, even Spaniards pressed into service. In theory, it numbered more than 600,000 men, supported by 200,000 horses and tens of thousands of wagons. In practice, perhaps 450,000 crossed the frontier into Russia in June 1812. The rest followed in reserve or remained behind guarding supply lines. Never before had logistics attempted to feed and move such a force across such distances. The French administrative machine could plan campaigns within Central Europe, where towns and roads were dense, but in Russia, distances were vast, villages poor, and roads little more than dirt tracks. Napoleon believed that speed would compensate for logistics, that a single decisive victory would force Alexander to negotiate. On 24th June 1812, the first French units began to cross the Niemen River near Kovno, in what is now Lithuania. The invasion began without a formal declaration of war. Witnesses described the river crossing as silent, with drums muffled and orders whispered. Napoleon watched the columns pass from a small knoll, remarking that the soldiers were about to open a new chapter in history. He expected a campaign of a few weeks, a swift march to the frontier towns, and a negotiated peace. The Russians did not cooperate. Opposing him were two main Russian armies, the First Army of the West under General Barclay de Tolly and the Second Army under Prince Bagration. Together, they numbered around 220,000 men. Outnumbered and unprepared to fight a pitched battle, they adopted a scorched earth strategy, retreating deeper into Russia and destroying food and forage as they went. Napoleon's columns followed, advancing eastward in the heat of a continental summer. By early July, the men were already suffering from dysentery and heat exhaustion. Horses collapsed in the dust. Supply wagons lagged far behind. For every mile the army advanced, its effective strength fell. At Vilna, Napoleon halted briefly to establish depots and await reports. The Tsar refused to negotiate. The emperor pressed on toward Vitebsk, hoping to trap Barclay before he could join Bagration. The two Russian armies slipped away. Frustrated, Napoleon entered Vitebsk on the 28th of July, calling it the beginning of peace. Yet the Russians had again avoided battle. The campaign was already behind schedule, and the heat was draining his army's numbers. The rear guards that remained fought delaying actions at small towns, Ostrovno, Mohilev, Krasnoye, but none brought the decisive victory Napoleon sought. In early August, the French learned that the Russians had united and were retreating toward Smolensk, an old fortified city on the Dnieper River. Napoleon hoped to catch them there. The approach to Smolensk was fought in extreme heat and choking dust. Soldiers marched for hours without water. The local countryside had been stripped bare. French diaries describe men boiling strips of leather for soup. Desertion began to rise. Still, on the 16th of August, 1812, the Grand Armée reached Smolensk. The Russians had fortified the city and prepared to defend it, but when the French began to bombard and set fires, Barclay de Tolly ordered a withdrawal rather than allow his army to be destroyed. Smolensk burned. When the French entered on August 18th, they found only ruins and wounded. The city's supplies had been evacuated or destroyed. Napoleon had gained a victory of appearance, but not of substance. Thousands of French soldiers looted the smoking ruins for food and drink. Disease spread rapidly through the ranks. The emperor lingered at Smolensk for 2 weeks, unsure whether to halt for the winter or continue toward Moscow. His staff advised caution. His instincts urged advance. The campaign that had been planned to end in 3 weeks had already consumed 2 months. By early September, Napoleon chose to press onward. He hoped that by occupying Moscow, the ancient capital, he could force the Tsar to sue for peace. The march from Smolensk to Moscow was about 270 kilometers, a journey that would normally take 2 weeks. It took nearly 4. The army moved through a landscape stripped bare by retreating Russians. Villages burned, fields were empty, wells poisoned. The soldiers marched hungry and exhausted. The once Grand Army had fallen to about 160,000 effectives. On the 7th of September, 1812, the French and Russian armies met near the village of Borodino, 125 kilometers west of Moscow. It was the only major battle of the campaign. The Russians, now commanded by the popular General Kutuzov, had chosen a defensive line along a series of earthworks and redoubts. Napoleon deployed his troops in a crescent, intending to crush the Russian left and roll up the line. At dawn, the guns opened, a thunder that continued for 12 hours. More than 1,000 cannon fired across a front only 8 kilometers wide. The French assaults were furious but piecemeal. Marshal Ney and Davout attacked repeatedly against entrenched infantry. The Russians counterattacked with cavalry. The fighting around the Raevsky Redoubt and the village of Borodino itself was savage. The ground changed hands several times. By afternoon, the entire battlefield was choked with smoke and bodies. Napoleon, suffering from illness, remained near his command post and refused to commit his final reserve, the Imperial Guard. By nightfall, both armies were shattered. The Russians withdrew in good order, leaving the French technically in possession of the field. Napoleon could claim victory, but it was hollow. Of about 130,000 French troops engaged, some 30,000 were killed or wounded. Russian losses were roughly the same. The road to Moscow lay open, but the Grand Armée was no longer the force it had been. On the 14th of September, a week after Borodino, Napoleon entered Moscow expecting to receive emissaries from the Tsar. None came. The city was largely deserted. That night, fires broke out across Moscow, whether by accident, by arson, or by deliberate Russian orders, has never been conclusively proven. Within 2 days, most of the wooden city was in flames. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as his supposed prize burned. Supplies vanished, shelters disappeared. The emperor waited a month for peace proposals that never arrived. Alexander had resolved not to negotiate. The Russian army remained intact to the east. Winter approached. At this point, the invasion had achieved nothing that Napoleon had intended. The Russian army had not been destroyed, the Tsar had not submitted, and the French logistic system had collapsed. Napoleon's staff warned that unless he withdrew soon, the army would perish. On the 19th of October, 1812, after 5 weeks in the ashes of Moscow, Napoleon ordered the retreat. He left the city with perhaps 100,000 men still under arms. The next stage of the campaign, the retreat from Moscow, would destroy almost all that remained. The retreat from Moscow began in clear autumn weather, but within days the first frosts arrived. Napoleon's intention was to withdraw along a southern route through Kaluga, where the countryside was less devastated and where food might still be found. However, when his advance guard encountered strong Russian forces at Maloyaroslavets on the 24th of October, the road south was blocked. The emperor decided to retreat along the same path by which he had advanced, the road through Smolensk. It was a fatal decision. The land along that line had already been stripped bare, and the route was littered with burned villages and wrecked wagons. The Grand Armée was no longer a coherent fighting force. Its units marched in long, disordered columns, mingled with civilians, camp followers, and wounded. The horses, already exhausted, died by thousands. Guns and wagons were abandoned. At first the men marched in silence. Then discipline broke down. Stragglers were picked off by Cossack patrols. Temperatures dropped steadily. By early November, snow began to fall. The Russian army under Kutuzov followed at a distance, content to harass the retreat rather than risk a pitched battle. Light cavalry struck at the rear guard, cutting down isolated groups and destroying bridges. The French burned every village they entered for warmth, leaving nothing behind. Many soldiers marched barefoot, their uniforms in rags. Frostbite, starvation, and typhus claimed more men than combat. Diaries describe the sound of the army at night, coughing, moaning, the creak of frozen wagons. The road became a trail of bodies and broken equipment. Napoleon reached Smolensk again on the 9th of November, hoping to find rest and supplies. The magazines there had been looted by earlier arrivals. For a week, the remnants of the army crowded the burning city, fighting over scraps of food. By the time they left, no more than 40,000 men remained under arms. From here, the retreat became a struggle for survival. At Krasnoye, between the 15th and 18th of November, Kutuzov attempted to cut off the French entirely. The Imperial Guard and a few regular units held the line long enough for the main body to escape, but at a terrible cost. Marshal Ney, commanding the rearguard, led what became known as the Passage of Krasnoye, fighting his way through encircling Russian forces with barely 3,000 men remaining from his original corps of 12,000. Napoleon called him the bravest of the brave, yet by then bravery no longer mattered. The army was dying. As December began, temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. The survivors staggered westward toward the Berezina River, where Napoleon hoped to cross into friendly territory. The river was swollen with ice, and the bridges destroyed. Russian armies converged from north and south to trap him. At this point, the Grand Armée numbered perhaps 25,000 effectives, accompanied by twice as many stragglers. Engineers worked in freezing water to construct makeshift bridges from wagons and timbers. Under constant artillery fire, the French managed to throw 2 bridges across the river near Studianka on the 26th of November, 1812. For 2 days, a chaotic mass of soldiers, civilians, and horses crossed the icy water. Russian guns pounded the banks. Many men fell into the river and drowned beneath floating ice. Napoleon himself crossed on the evening of the 28th of November, watching as the last formations of his army fought to hold off the pursuing Russians. When the bridges were finally destroyed to prevent pursuit, thousands were left behind. Of the 500,000 who had begun the invasion, fewer than 100,000 reached the western bank, and only about 10,000 remained fit for duty. From the Berezina to the Niemen, the retreat continued through snowstorms and famine. On the 5th of December, near Smorgony, Napoleon transferred command of the remnants to Marshal Murat and set off for Paris in a light sleigh. He had learned of a political crisis at home and feared for his throne. Traveling incognito through Poland and Germany, he reached Paris on the 18th of December, 1812, only 6 months after he had begun the greatest campaign of his career. The empire he had built was still intact on paper, but the myth of his invincibility was gone. The Grand Army no longer existed. Of the original invasion force, fewer than 50,000 returned across the Niemen. Tens of thousands more perished in captivity or from disease during the following months. Russian losses were also enormous, perhaps 200,000, killed, wounded, or dead from exposure. But Russia could replace them. France could not. The campaign was not only a military disaster, but a political one. It encouraged Prussia and Austria, both nominal French allies, to reconsider their loyalties. Within months, they would join a new coalition against France. News of the catastrophe reached Europe gradually. At first, official bulletins minimized the scale of the losses. By early 1813, the truth was clear. The greatest army ever assembled in Europe had been destroyed not by a single battle, but by distance, weather, and miscalculation. Napoleon's reputation as the master of logistics and maneuver had collapsed. In later years, even his admirers called the Russian invasion his greatest mistake. The lessons of the 1812 campaign have been studied ever since. Napoleon's operational planning had assumed that the Russian army would defend its western frontier, and that one decisive engagement would end the war. He failed to anticipate that the Russians would trade space for time, drawing him deeper into a wasteland. His logistical system, designed for compact campaigns in Germany and Italy, could not function over hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. The reliance on local foraging, which had served him well in fertile regions, proved fatal in Russia. The weather, often blamed for the defeat, was only the final blow to an army already exhausted and starving. Accounts from survivors provide the most vivid record. Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard described men cutting flesh from dead horses for food, melting snow for water, and freezing to death in their sleep. Entire regiments disappeared between one camp and the next. The few who reached Poland looked more like beggars than soldiers. Witnesses in Warsaw recalled skeleton-like men wrapped in rags, dragging themselves through the streets, unable to speak. These were veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, the finest troops in Europe. Now they were ghosts. The Russian pursuit ended only when the last remnants had crossed the Niemen in December. Kutuzov halted his army, content that the invader had been expelled. The Tsar entered Vilna in triumph, proclaiming that Europe had been saved from tyranny. For Russia, 1812 became the Patriotic War, a foundational legend of national endurance. For France, it was a trauma that would haunt an entire generation. In 1813, Napoleon rebuilt his army from conscripts and fought the campaigns of Germany, Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden, and finally Leipzig. But he would never again command the veteran corps that had carried him to victory across Europe. The loss of so many officers and experienced men in Russia crippled his empire's military foundation. When the Allies invaded France in 1814, resistance collapsed. Napoleon abdicated and went into exile on the island of Elba. His empire, born in revolution and raised on conquest, had fallen in little more than 2 years after the retreat from Moscow. Historians continue to debate why Napoleon persisted in the invasion, even as conditions deteriorated. Some argue that he was trapped by his own reputation, the man who had never accepted stalemate, who believed that every problem could be solved by boldness. Others see it as a failure of information. Reports from the front were delayed or optimistic, and by the time he realized the extent of his losses, it was too late to turn back. Napoleon himself later claimed that he had been betrayed by the elements and by fortune, but not by his own judgment. Yet his correspondence shows that he underestimated the scale of Russia and overestimated his ability to impose peace by force. The invasion of Russia marked a turning point not only in his career, but in the history of warfare. It demonstrated that even the most brilliant general could not overcome the limits of supply and geography. The campaign covered more than 2,000 kilometers from the Niemen to Moscow and back, a distance greater than all his previous campaigns combined. The same mobility that had once been his strength became his enemy. The speed of his advance outran his supply lines, and the same roads that carried him east became traps on the return. In the long winter that followed, Europe prepared for renewed war. Prussia rose in revolt. Austria began to mobilize. Britain increased its subsidies to the Continental Allies. The coalition that would eventually defeat Napoleon at Leipzig in 1813 and at Waterloo in 1815 was born from the ashes of the Russian campaign. Years later, in exile on St. Helena, Napoleon spoke often of 1812. He told his secretary, Las Casas, that of all my campaigns, this was the most terrible, the most instructive. He admitted that he had misjudged the Tsar and the Russian people. He said, "It was not the snow that destroyed me, but the fires of Smolensk and Moscow." The invasion, he concluded, was a gamble too far, a campaign that began in ambition and ended in annihilation. The human cost defies easy comprehension. Modern estimates suggest that more than 400,000 French and Allied soldiers died, along with perhaps 200,000 Russians. Civilian casualties from famine and disease added to the toll. Entire regions of western Russia and Poland were devastated. For the survivors, the memory of 1812 never faded. The veterans called themselves les rescapés de la Moskowa, the survivors of Moscow. Few could speak of it without tears. In the centuries since, the campaign has remained a symbol of the dangers of overreach in war. Historians have compared it to later invasions of Russia by Charles XII of Sweden in the 18th century, by Hitler in the 20th. In each case, the vastness of the land, the harshness of the climate, and the determination of its people defeated armies that seemed unstoppable. The lesson was always the same. Space and endurance can be stronger than brilliance and ambition. For Napoleon, the Russian invasion destroyed not only his army, but his myth. Until 1812, he had seemed invincible, the master strategist who always found a way to turn difficulty into victory. After 1812, he was a man pursued by his own legend, fighting to recover what could never be regained. The emperor who once crowned himself in the glory of Austerlitz ended his career surrounded by defeat. Yet even in failure, his campaign of 1812 remains one of the most studied in military history. Its detail, march routes, weather records, casualty lists, has filled volumes of analysis. The story endures not merely as a tale of destruction, but as a lesson in the limits of human ambition. When the snows closed over the tracks of the Grand Armée, Europe changed forever. The world that emerged after 1812 would be one where empires learned caution and where even the most powerful rulers knew that there were frontiers which no will could cross. Napoleon's march to Moscow had begun as an assertion of control. It ended as a reminder of the uncontrollable. In that sense, the invasion of Russia was not only the turning point of the Napoleonic Wars, but one of the defining tragedies of European history.